On today's show, the NBA season is here. The Cavs have 3 games this week. I bring in the experts to talk about the Toronto Raptors, the Detroit Pistons, and the Washington Wizards. Let's learn more about the Cavs' first 3 opponents on today's edition of Locked On Cavs.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? My name is Danny Cunningham. You might know me from my time covering the Cleveland Cavaliers, places like my new Substack, The Inside Shot, 92.3 The Fan, Cleveland Magazine, and a number of other stops along the way. I want to say thank you to you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen today and every day. You can find the show anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, anywhere else. Make sure you leave us a 5-star rating. Leave us a nice review as well. Also available on YouTube. Just search Locked On Cavs on YouTube. If you're watching this video right now, click that thumbs up button for me, hit subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss the latest Locked On Cavs content, just like this video that's going up right now. Of course, a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is sponsored by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So for this show, I brought in the Locked On hosts that cover the teams the Cavs are playing in their first week. This is something I want to start doing on a weekly basis now that the season is here. So Sean Woodley coming in, covers the Toronto Raptors. You're going to hear from him next. Cavs open up in Toronto on Wednesday night. Then Ku Khahil, who covers the Detroit Pistons, an old friend, JB Bickerstaff. He will be coming up in segment number 2. And lastly, Brandon Scott, with some really interesting things to say about the Washington Wizards, joins me today for segment number 3 as the Cavs are in DC to take on the Wizards Saturday night. So again, thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen today and every day. This show might be your second listen today, considering this is episode number 2 of the day for Locked On Cavs. But NBA season is here. Regular season games for the Cavs. I'm so excited. Let's learn just a little bit more about what this Cavs team is going to be facing in the first week of basketball action. Here is 10 minutes with Sean Woodley. Welcome in now, the host of Locked On Raptors, Sean Woodley, with the Cavs opening up in Toronto on Wednesday to start the season. Thought it'd be a good time to catch up with him. Sean, first off, thank you for taking some time jumping on Locked On Cavs to preview, in some senses, this gigantic season opening game. But I just want to ask, with the preseason having come and gone, what have you liked about the Raptors so far? What have you not liked about the Raptors so far?
Look, I'm not someone who typically goes into preseason with my mind open to being changed about things because the preseason means nothing. That said, I kind of buy that the Raptors are going to be maybe a little bit better than was projected, or just less depressing, I suppose. Fun bad is kind of the term I've been throwing around, and what I'm hoping the Raptors can be this year. I feel pretty convinced after watching the preseason that they're going to be fun bad. Whether they're any good, I think those are kind of narrow ranges of outcomes where they might actually sort of flirt with being all right. But I think if nothing else, this is a team full of early to mid 20-somethings, guys who have a lot to prove, guys who are kind of stepping into new roles and testing their limits. And I think when you couple all that together with what seems to be a brand new ethos of being annoying tryhards, which was kind of the theme of their defense throughout the preseason, I don't think they're going to win 45 games or anything like that, but I do think they're going to have a shot to be pretty entertaining, even if they lose a lot more than they actually win. And that's kind of the prevailing takeaway from the preseason, on top of, oh my God, Scottie Barnes looks totally ready to be the dude.
Yeah, and Barnes being the dude is obviously, I think, the thing to watch with Toronto. I love that you threw out the fun bad, I guess, mantra or expectation, because that is, there are much worse places to be. I would much rather be fun bad than what Brooklyn's going to be this year. Because when I think of fun bad, I actually, to tie this back to the Cavs, I think of the Kenny Atkinson Nets from 2017. That's what I think of with fun bad. And that's a team that, can find its way into the playoffs. The way I think of the Raptors, Sean, and maybe I'm wrong here, and this might be more of a Eastern Conference overview thing, but they're sort of in the, somebody has to finish 10th race. That's where I think the Raptors could end up this year.
100%. I think I'd pencil them in to be the 10th seed right now. Honestly, I think if Charlotte gets their crap together, they're probably more talented and have a better shot just because LaMelo Ball has proven he can be a guy who drives winning at a high level. We've yet to see that from Scottie Barnes. I think we'll probably start to see that this year, but we know LaMelo, when he's healthy and on, is someone who can carry a team to a pretty decent record. That's just like a gigantic coin flip and a huge, shoulder shrug as to whether or not they're actually going to do that. So yeah, I would probably bank on the Raptors being 10th. And it's not because I think the Raptors are very good. I projected them for like 33, 34 wins. And that's kind of on the high end, I think, of what most people think about this team. I just think the bottom of the East is that bad. I think the Nets and Wizards are miserable. I don't think the Pistons are going to be saved by Tobias Harris and Malik Beasley. And I think the Bulls, giving the keys to Josh Giddey, have a chance to be like a full-on cataclysm of horrible basketball. And I relish it as someone who doesn't really like the Bulls or care if the Bulls are good. So that's fun. I think the Raptors, just by having like some pretty reasonable talent at the top, having a guy in Scottie Barnes who is better than any of the players in any of these teams outside of maybe LaMelo at his peak, though we haven't seen that for a couple of years, I think they have the best shot at being the 10th seed of that group of 6. Will they be any higher than that? I don't think so. I think they have like one of the narrowest ranges of outcomes of any team in the league. I think it's like 10th, 11th, maybe 12th in the East, and that's where they're going to be. And you're just going to have to deal with that if you're a Raptors fan and you're someone who loves lottery balls. Thankfully, I'm not someone who's duped by the fantasy that is the lottery and having it save your team. But lots of people are. But yeah, I think you're totally right. Someone's going to back into that play-in spot, and I think the Raptors have a pretty good shot of doing that, barring them not pulling the chute and actively trying to lose games down the stretch, which is definitely on the table for a team that still could use a bit of a talent infusion via the draft. Though because of the disparity between the conferences, they could be the 6th worst team in the Eastern Conference, but also like the 8th or 9th worst team in the league and kind of have the best of both worlds there. So I think that's a pretty good summation of where the Raptors sit coming into this year.
Well, I do think as far as, ping pong balls and lottery go, my everydayers at Locked On Cavs can certainly say, there are worse places to be. Winning the lottery, not always bad. Sometimes not good if you end up in a draft.
Sometimes you get Andrea Bargnani.
Sometimes you get Anthony Bennett. Sometimes you get LeBron James. It's the best of the both worlds in Cleveland. But you said something as far as Scottie Barnes goes, because he is obviously like the lottery balls are one thing. But Scottie Barnes' development is the most important thing for Toronto. And you said that he, throughout the preseason, looks like a guy that is ready to be the dude on a team, that is ready to start to carry a team. I don't know how far that is this year, but this is something that could be very beneficial for years down the line for Toronto. To you, what does that look like so far? Like what this preseason, which again, with a grain of salt, but what this preseason has looked different about Scottie than before?
I mean, I think it's just like the force and verve he's playing with. I mean, he's always been super impressive physically. He's always been someone who can kind of get to wherever he wants to go on the floor. It's been sort of matching those physical gifts with night to night, kind of carrying it through the course of full games. It used to be that he would just be really good in fourth quarters and kind of drag himself through 3 quarters. And then last season, it became more of he can carry himself over 4 quarters, but sometimes there are nights where it's not quite there, or he's not totally bought in, or he's kind of drifting or whatever. I think we saw in the preseason, and we only saw him play 4 games, but I do think we saw sort of over the course of 48 minutes, this sort of just very powerful version of Scottie Barnes, turning the corner from a standstill when creating at the top of the arc in a way he never really has been able to do. Sort of conducting the team in transition in a way that he's very good at, but just sort of like really, really dialed in, really locked in. Defensively, I think, we made a really big jump last year as sort of like a helper, a guy at the rim getting blocks and steals. I think we saw in the preseason some of the best flashes of on-ball perimeter defense we've ever seen from Scottie Barnes. And a lot of that is attentiveness, not getting over his skis and just kind of staying locked in. I think that version of Scottie Barnes that we saw, particularly this past Tuesday, they played Boston in a preseason game, and Boston had most of their guys going Tatum Brown, and Barnes was the best player on the floor by a pretty comfortable margin, had 26, 9, and 10. He hit a bunch of threes, and he was 5 of 9 from downtown. He's working in pick and roll creation. He's working in self-creation and sort of mid-range shooting, and he's getting to the rim whenever he wants. Like, it just looks like a guy who knows that this team has made a huge bet on him. Spent the offseason, spent the back part of last season on the bench, kind of learning the ropes as the guy from the sidelines. He talked about that being a big thing for him going into the offseason, to just sort of get a view from the sidelines of what it takes to kind of guide the ship and the sort of leadership stuff, the sort of intangible stuff that you can't really quantify, that he kind of took a liking to sort of wanting to sort of nurture and stuff going into the offseason. It seems like that's been a thing. He talked about wanting to improve his communication overall and just kind of being a guy who can center and organize the team. And that feels like it's translating so far in the preseason. And a Scottie Barnes who is playing like he did in the preseason is definitely a guy who can make the jump from being an all-star injury replacement to, an all-NBA contender. And when you have an all-NBA level guy in your team, that's going to drag you to some wins you maybe weren't projected for. And so that's where my optimism comes in. The team makes sense around him as well. This was a team that before it was Scottie, it was Pascal Siakam, it was OG Anunoby, it was Precious Achua, it was all these wings, very little spacing, so little guard play, especially with like Dennis Schroeder at the start of last season running the show into the ground, I might say. And so like this year, it's Emmanuel Quickley with on and off ball juice. Grady Dick, who's looked awesome in the preseason as an off ball guy and just like a dead eye shooter. RJ Barrett, who was so good for the Raptors after the trade last year. No one not watched the Raptors, so no one really saw it, but he was a completely different player than he was in New York. And Jakob Poeltl as this connector big man who kind of ties it all together, gives them a spine on defense. Their starters should be really good. And when Scottie Barnes is stirring the drink like he was in the preseason, I feel even better about that. After that, we'll see. The bench could be kind of a disaster if things don't break right here. But I do feel very good about the starters, and Scottie Barnes is the reason why I feel like it can all come together there.
All right. So the last time the Cavs opened a season in Toronto was the first regular season game that Donovan Mitchell played in a Cavs uniform. And of course, Darius Garland came back to Cleveland basically without an eyelid from that night, which it was last year. I believe Gary Trent Jr. was the one to do that.
That's right.
This is going to be Kenny Atkinson's first game on the sideline for the Cavs in Toronto. Do I have to worry about anyone coming back without an eyelid, Sean?
So Gary Trent Jr. is not around anymore, so you got to worry about that. I feel like the identity the team used to have under Nick Nurse of like being nasty and over aggressive and elbowy and stuff, that's not really there anymore. They were very plush on defense last season. No eyelids getting ripped off by last year's Raptors. That said, they came into this season with a sort of newfound identity on defense where their whole thing now is we're going to be really annoying at the point of attack. We're going to have high pickup points. We're going to play, something sort of derived from like European soccer high press where we're going to meet guys, full court, half court, really kind of get in their shirts. And they have the guys to do it. Davion Mitchell, not a very good offensive player, but we know that he has the nickname Off Night for a reason. He's a very good on-ball guard. I think, the Jamal Shed is a rookie point guard they brought in out of Houston. He was literally the defensive player of the year in college last year as a 6-foot point guard. He's nasty. And that seems to have kind of infused the whole team. They've talked a lot about the contagiousness of just like really wanting to get into the shirt of guys. And so, yeah, you could see the Raptors be a very nasty, annoying point of attack team. Maybe an eyelid or two gets in the way there. I don't think it'll be quite as sort of, reckless as they used to be on defense, where their whole thing was just like flying by the seat of their pants and, recovering and jumping for steals and stuff like that. So bit of a different thing. It's certainly going to be less of a cakewalk to play the Raptors this year than it was last year. But yeah, keep your eyes out because, Jamal Shed is going to be coming for you and he's small and jumpy. And I don't know how sharp his fingernails are, but hopefully they're not hurting any eyelids this time around.
Yes, let's hope everyone can stay healthy Wednesday night when the season opens. If you are a Cavs fan listening to this and you want to learn more about the Cavs opening night opponent in the Toronto Raptors, go check out Sean at Locked On Raptors. He's got you covered with everything you need to know about the NBA's team up north. Sean, thanks so much for doing this.
Anytime, man.
Today's show is brought to you by BetterHelp. What is something that scares you? Maybe you can share fear right now out loud in your head, something that frightens you no matter how big or small, because Halloween right around the corner, right? Well, Halloween lets us have fun with what scares us, whether it's ghosts, ghouls, skeletons, clowns. I don't know. There's a lot of scary things in the world, but some of those fears might not involve the zombies and ghosts and all the other scary things that I just named. They might involve real life things, and something that can help with those real life things is therapy. Therapy is a great tool for facing your fears and finding ways to overcome them, because sometimes the scariest thing is not facing our fears in the first place and holding ourselves back, because whether you've been to therapy, whether you haven't been to therapy, you probably have some fears, and dealing with those fears with therapy can be a very helpful experience because it is very helpful to learn positive coping skills, how to set boundaries. It can be very empowering to help yourself be the best version of yourself. It's not just for those that have experienced major trauma throughout their lives. Therapy can be for everybody. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp will be there for you. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Life can get really busy, right? You need to have therapy that is suited to your schedule. BetterHelp is just that. So fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. I think that's a really important thing because it can be difficult to find a therapist that works for you. BetterHelp allowing you to switch therapists at any time for no additional charge, really important thing. So overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's LOCKEDON NBA today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA, LOCKEDON NBA for 10% off your first month with BetterHelp. And now we bring in Ku Khahil, covers the Detroit Pistons for the Locked On Pistons podcast. Cavs take on Detroit in their home opener Friday night. That means old friend JB Bickerstaff going to make his return to Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. Ku, thanks for doing this. How's life with JB on the sidelines up in Detroit?
It's been more fun than it was last year. I'll say that. There is a level of JB has impressed me. I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit, but he has impressed me a little bit. But there is just a level of, until the regular season starts, of am I enjoying this more simply because it's not Monty, or is it because JB is actually like just that impressive? So we'll wait to see it, but early signs have been good.
So the thing I'll say about JB, like I do think, and I know I was on with you on Locked On Pistons shortly after they made the hire. Like he's going to come in there and he's going to be a culture setter for that team. I wouldn't expect Detroit to, and maybe you have wildly different expectations than I do for this Pistons team. I wouldn't expect them to be like a playoff team right away, but I think that they're going to look much different in a good way when they're on the floor this year at the Pizza Palace, right? Little Caesars Arena, whatever it is called up there in Detroit. I think it's going to be a much different product for you to watch this year.
Yeah, I think already, I just recorded my podcast like an hour ago, and one of the topics on there was just the culture and the way things feel different already. So I think that already, what you're mentioning 100% is already being felt, not just on the floor, but in the locker room, at practices. At Media Day, we had multiple players that were on the team last year openly come out and say that, the veterans are more involved this year. The coaching staff feels more involved, like things are different. Like, I don't feel like they meant to throw shots at the last year's team, but like they were like openly just like not even hiding like that things feel completely different for the better. So yeah, I think JB's already having an effect with the culture, like you mentioned.
Right. I think that is something that you will see clear. I think that's going to be a team that, they might not come out and immediately be a really good defensive team, but they're going to be a team that gives much more effort on the defensive end of the floor than they did before. So I kind of want to get into this, but what are your expectations in Detroit for year one with JB? Like, what do you expect this team to look like? How do you expect them to finish record-wise? Just what are you looking to see with the Pistons?
Yeah, it's talking about expectations with the Pistons. I've said this on the podcast last week. It's going to be it's tough to really figure out what is fair expectations because the team won 14 games this past year. It was the worst season in Pistons history. So if you just win, so their over-under is like 24.5. If they were to win 24 games, that's a 10-win improvement over last year. But should the bar really be like last year? It's like, should you really be holding the bar of, let's not be the worst team in the NBA by a mile? Like, is it really, let's not have the worst season in Pistons history? Like, should that be the bar in year 4, year 5, or your rebuild? So it's like, okay, well, if it's not that, then what should it be? Because the team did win 14 games last year. So what should actually be the bar? So it's hard to decipher what should be adequate expectations for the Pistons. I think the main thing that I personally believe should be expected out of this team, and Trajan kind of mentioned it. Trajan Langdon, that is the Pistons president of basketball operations. Kind of mentioned
Cavs legend.
Yeah, there you go. At a press conference that you want to be playing meaningful games in March and April. And that doesn't have to be like playoff games, but like the Pistons shouldn't be benching their guys in March because of injuries to try to get a top pick. Like that shouldn't be happening anymore. Like they should be playing for games at the end of the year that even if they don't make the play-in, but at least competing, like, oh, they're in the race. They're like 4 games behind. They're trying to catch up. Like something like that. That should be the goal. If they make the play-in, cool. If not, whatever. But they shouldn't be just, benching players to try to get Cooper Flag again. That should not be what they do this year.
Right. And I actually think an interesting way to look at this, and it's a rarity to be able to say this in the NBA, but because of what the Pistons were last year, you can hear, like, I think fair expectations should be that team doubles its win total from a year ago. Like they go from 14 to 28. And I know you said the total at FanDuel set at 24.5. Like, I think that is something that the goal should be to be above that comfortably. I don't know if they will be able to do that. We'll have to wait and see what the product looks like when the games begin to count this week. But the one guy that I look at when I think of the Detroit Pistons is like the guy that can still make that impact, that can take them from a 14-win team to maybe not like a play-in caliber team, but also not the worst team in basketball, is Cade Cunningham. He hasn't been able to stay as healthy as I think everyone would have liked throughout his career so far. But what do you expect from him as he enters what I think is a pretty big season for him in Detroit?
Again, expectations is tough, man. I think Cade, what he wants to do this year, he wants to make the All-Star team, and he wants to firmly plant himself as one of the best players in the NBA. That's where he wants to be this year. And I think that is probably what a lot of people's expectation within Detroit is also for him. This is a former number 1 overall pick. I think one of the things that really gets lost in last year was the team was horrible, but Cade really took a lot of steps forward in a lot of areas last year. And if the team around him simply was competent, people would be talking about him a lot differently right now. The fact he was able to have the season he had this past year with what he had around him makes it more impressive to me, to be honest. If he had the past season with spacing and a competent roster, yeah, it would be a fine jump, but it wasn't like a crazy leap. The fact he was able to make the improvements in efficiency, in finishing, in shooting, and cut down on turnovers with the type of spacing he was dealing with, sharing 1,000 minutes with Killian Hayes and James Wiseman. Like, the fact he was able to do that, it makes it more impressive because he was able to thrive in really terrible circumstances. So this upcoming, in preseason, especially the last 2 games, he just looked exceptional. I think he led the preseason NBA in assists. I know preseason doesn't matter. Try not to read too much into it, but I know he worked a lot on his floater to try to cut down on the tough attempts at the rim. So I think you're going to see that a part of his game. And I know that he's been really working hard. I talked with him, his trainer, and his brother this offseason. I know pull-up shooting from beyond the arc is something he's really trying to make a lethal part of his game as well. I think Cade expects to be one of the best players in the Eastern Conference this upcoming year. And I think his goal is to kind of let people know why he went number 1 a few years ago.
So one of the things the Pistons did do this offseason to try and, surround Cade with better players was signing a couple or acquiring a few veterans, Tobias Harris, Tim Hardaway Jr., Malik Beasley, I think you can count into there. What have you seen from those guys? How have they improved the situation in Detroit so far?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned earlier, and it honestly, hearing you say it earlier kind of makes me feel a little better about the situation going into the regular season, because kind of what you're mentioning is exactly what we've talked about being so impressed about in the Pistons community, which is even the veterans who are not good defenders are competing hard defensively in preseason games. Like, these are guys that don't need to take preseason serious at all. Like, they have long careers that have established themselves as NBA players. They don't need to take preseason that seriously. But JB has all of them. Tobias, Tim Hardaway Jr., Malik Beasley, all competing defensively, making rotations off ball, competing hard on ball. There was a game in preseason, Malik Beasley had 5 fouls, and it wasn't from him getting charges offensively. Like, that was from him just getting physical defensively. And that's not to say you want them fouling out of games, but it kind of just shows that, like, they're giving effort and being physical defensively. So I think that, like I said, Marcus Sasser, Jane Ivey, and I believe also Isaiah Stewart also mentioned at media day that these veterans are completely different than last year. They're impactful. They're actually bought into the team off the floor. They're more into their lives. Like they're just around more and more bought into what they're trying to do. So I think these veterans are going to have a big impact on the team this upcoming year. Obviously on the court wise, being able to space the floor offensively. You already saw some of that. I broke down a couple of those plays on my YouTube, just how the spacing principles are different compared to last year with JB and this lineup and this roster of shooters that they have around Cade and Jay and Ivy. They'll be impactful on the court, but even off the court, it seems like they're already having a bigger impact. And I think a lot of that has to go to the veterans, but also JB Bickerstaff for establishing this type of culture this quickly. It seems like just through training camp and preseason where, you can be veterans, but we want you giving your all in preseason and set the standard early.
Well, we will see exactly what this Detroit Pistons team looks like this week. And if you want to learn more about the Pistons before they open up the season with the Cavaliers, or open up the Cavaliers home portion of the season, I should say, Friday at Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. Check out Ku on Locked On Pistons. Check out his YouTube where he does a lot of good film breakdowns as well. So make sure you're checking out all that if you want to get smarter about the Pistons. If you want to get smarter about basketball, Ku's the place to go. Ku, thanks so much for taking the time, man.
Appreciate you.
Today's episode also brought to you by FanDuel. It is time to talk about America's #1 sportsbook. Why am I so excited to talk about FanDuel today? Because we have a point spread for a real Cavs basketball game. For the first time that I've been hosting the Locked On Cavs podcast, FanDuel has a point spread for a regular season Cavs basketball game because the regular season is finally here, and FanDuel is the place to go if you want to get in on the action. The Cavs are favored by 5.5 points on the road in Toronto. Obviously, there can be a shift in that because there's still quite a bit of time before game time, before opening tip arrives on Wednesday night. But 5.5 points, I think the Cavs are going to look pretty good in Toronto. Or maybe you don't want to worry about the point spread. You think, hey, they're just going to win. I want to take them on the money line. Cavs are minus 215 on the money line to beat the Toronto Raptors. I think they are going to win that game. I think this Cavs team going to get off to a very good start, even if Max Strus not in the starting lineup. So FanDuel is the place to go if you like either of those things. FanDuel is also the place to go if you want to check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page that you place your bets, because FanDuel has not only great odds, great boosts, great bonuses, but they've got all of that stuff too. Plus, right now, you will get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You heard me correctly. $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet with FanDuel. So head on over to America's #1 sports book, FanDuel. Go to FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com today, and you can get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. And now joined by Brandon Scott, the host of the Locked On Wizards podcast. The Cavs take on the Wizards in Washington this Saturday night for their third game of the season. Want to get to know them a little bit better, and they are a team that has some young, exciting talent. Brandon, first, thanks so much for doing this. Secondly, what excites you about getting to watch Alex Sarr play his first regular season games coming up this week?
Oh, very excited, man. I mean, he is unreal. I mean, he's going to be a future unicorn. I mean, a guy, is 7'1". He can stretch the floor. He's a rim protector. He can rebound. He can move down the floor. If you look at the fact that we had Jordan Poole as the starting point guard, we were second in pace last year in the second half of the season. This is going to be a team that's going to run. It's going to be a fast team. They're going to hit defenses in the mouth on the transition. So I'm very excited to watch this young team roll.
One of the things that does excite me about Saturday night's game is on a Cavs standpoint, where they play Toronto Wednesday and then they play Detroit Friday, two teams that I don't think are going to play super fast, but the Cavs, like a lot of teams in the preseason, right? Like we hear this every year from a lot of teams. Oh, we want to play faster this year. Well, the Wizards are a team that I don't necessarily know wants to play faster than they were the year before because they led the NBA in pace the year before. But I think the Cavs want to be closer to the top than they were last year, where they were 24th. So I do think that this will be a very exciting matchup between two teams that want to play fast. And it's something that I'm excited to see what the Cavs look like matching up against a faster paced team. As somebody who has watched a team that's played fast versus me, somebody who's covered a team that has played much slower under former head coach JB Bickerstaff, what type of thing should I expect? I'm asking for advice here. What type of thing should I expect from a team that's going to play much faster than it previously?
Good question, man. Looking at the Wizards, it's going to be a team where, they don't utilize the shot clock as much as I wish they would. If you look at Jordan Poole, he's a guy where he's a scoring-minded combo guard. So he still has some bad tendencies because he's trying to, revert to being a full-time point guard where, sometimes he'll shoot early in in transition and early in the shot clock. Kyle Kuzma, our number one option, he's a guy who's a little too reliant on his jump shot. So you're going to see a guy who's going to put a lot of shots up. But the biggest thing with these two, they're learning more and more how to get other people involved. So you look at the Wizards, that Kyle Kuzma and Jordan Poole can be your option number one and number two. But really, you got to look at Bilal Coulibaly, Alex Sarr, and Jonas Valanciunas because Jonas Valanciunas gives Jordan Poole a really good pick and pop and pick and roll combination, man. So, I think the only question mark is Jonas Valanciunas getting a little older. Can he get up and down the court? But we've seen several different lineups this preseason where, sometimes you see Bilal at the two, Alex Sarr, has started at center. So this is a very versatile team. So looking at a potential starting lineup, new head coach Brian Keefe, he's going to do a good job of really game planning and looking at the Cavs, the roster and the starting five and really base it off of that. Because, if you look at former head coach Wesley Sell Jr., he was very stagnant with the starting lineup. So I think that's the one thing to look for in DC is that, number one, we're going to start game planning more. Number two, a lot of versatility on his roster. So, one night you can see one guy playing the three, next night playing the two.
A lot of versatility on that roster. Also, a lot of veterans that you named. And as you and I were talking before we pressed record, you mentioned Kyle Kuzma, a guy whose name has been no stranger to being in trade rumors. I think Jonas Valanciunas, another one, maybe even Jordan Poole. Who do you expect on this roster to not be there by the time the trade deadline rolls around in early February?
Oh, good question, man. This was actually a question I asked General Manager Will Dawkins in Media Day this season. And he said, look, the second half of the season, this team's going to get very, very younger because, eventually it has to be a youth movement. You got to try to find chemistry between these young guys because they're the core going forward. Names I'm looking at are definitely gone. It was Malcolm Brogdon. Now he's down with an injury. And the biggest thing with him is an injury pass. So, how far does his trade value go down? But Jonas Valanciunas, he got interest from the Knicks before Karl Anthony Towns trade. I'm looking at the Lakers as a big destination for him because they need some depth behind Anthony Davis or a guy who can allow Anthony Davis to maybe slide to the four. Kyle Kuzma is a guy that's very intriguing because he's a guy that is much loved by the organization and he's set roots here in the DMV where, he's got a couple of businesses, but saying that he's clearly not part of the future. He's a guy that the asking price right now is 2 first-round picks. I don't think they're going to get that. I think realistically you're looking at a first-round pick and maybe a young player in return. So Kyle Kuzma is a guy who is getting a lot of interest now. And the guy, if you look at the Wizards fan base, you look at the Denny Avdia trade, which wasn't a much loved trade in DC, including myself. But if you look at that trade, they're not scared to make a move. So you can look at probably any player on the roster outside of the 5 draft picks under Will Dawkins. Everybody's tradable at this point.
I think that is the right way to look at this as that team goes through the rebuild that they're going through because they do have some nice young talent. Like we'll see what Sarr looks like when the real games start. I know you've spoke highly of him already, but we have to see it in, regular season NBA games. Bub Carrington, another guy I want to ask about who I believe was the number 19 overall pick, another first round player that I think a lot of people have marked to have a bright future. What have you thought of him so far?
Man, the kid's a dog. I mean, he's a baller, man. I mean, we were able to move the 14, acquire the 14th pick from the Portland Trailblazers for Denny Avdia, and we also received the 2029 first-round pick and Malcolm Brogdon. Like I said, the Denny trade was the most popular trade. But if you look at the fact that we got a veteran guard in Brogdon, we got the asking price of 2 first-round picks, and we're able to acquire a talent who, he's from Baltimore, so, he's a local product. The kid can play. I think the biggest question mark with him is what does the long-term look as far as not only with him, but with Jordan Poole, because he's a guy who could potentially either be a backcourt mate with him or could be a kind of blocking his way at being the future point guard. And this organization made it known that they're going to invest heavily in a potential backcourt of Jordan Poole and Bub Carrington because Bub Carrington can't play off ball. But, like I said, Jordan, you mentioned it before. Jordan Poole's a guy where he's a very intriguing player too, because if he plays well enough like I think he will, because I think he's going to be getting votes for most improved player. But if he plays at the level I think he is, his trade value could go up. And if you look at his contract, that's a lot of money off the books if you're able to move a piece like Jordan Poole. So, and Bub Carrington, he's a dog, man. I mean, he can flat out score, he can shoot. Defensively, right now he's not a lockdown guy, but he's a guy who shows a lot of effort on the defensive end and just brings that dog mentality. And, I mentioned in time dog. Here in DC, especially under the previous GM, Tommy Shepard liked to draft a lot of guys who are finesse guys. We need more guys who are like hard-nosed guys, guys who are willing to battle it out. And we need that type of identity, because the biggest thing with a team like the Wizards, right now we're trying to solidify the culture. Second, we're trying to, create our defensive identity. We're a historically bad defensive team. And if you look at head coach Brian Keefe, not only is he a really good developmental coach, if you look at his resume, which is immaculate, but he's the defensive-minded head coach. So we have to really create a defensive identity. And I think young pieces like Alex R, and then not only Buck Harrison, but Keyshawn George is a guy who's shown a lot of promise on the defensive end.
So I'm glad you brought up Brian Keefe, because he was elevated last year from an assistant to an interim. And then at the end of May, it was announced he was going to be the full-time head coach of the Wizards. Why do you think it was or wasn't the right decision to keep him in that head coaching position after being the interim for the second half of the season last year?
Oh, man, I was a big catalyst for him being the head coach. I made it known every time I went down there to cover the team that this is the guy. Matter of fact, it was right before they went to play the Celtics for the last game last year. And I said, hey, what do you think about the head coach search? Because a lot of people, including myself, think the head coach is already in the building. I'm a big catalyst because if you look at his resume, we're a young team where scouting and development has been really bad for the team for a long time. Now we have a revamped scouting department. If you look at his resume, dating back to OKC, Kevin Durant, he said himself, a lot of my development goes to Brian Keefe, James Harden, Russell Westbrook, Kristaps Porzingis, Brandon Ingram. This guy, wherever he goes, he develops guys to not only be good starters or all-stars. Some of the guys on his list are Hall of Famers. So this guy gets the best out of players. If you look at a player like Johnny Davis, which, he hasn't lived up to his 10th overall pick selection, with this being early on in the first full year under Brian Keefe, you see a guy where he's going to make the roster, where, last year, Johnny Davis probably, getting the pink slip, man. So he gets the best out of his players. And that's exactly what we need here in DC, man. Is he the long-term answer? We shall see. I look at him a lot like a Brett Brown with the process with the 76ers, where they brought in a developmental head coach, and then when it's time to go get that marquee name to lead them into the future, then they do that. So I kind of see that scenario. But look, if he can prove that he could be the long-term answer head coach, I have no problem with that, because he's shown in a short amount of time that not only can he get the best out of these players, they believe in what he's preaching. He game plans. He's not stagnant. He sets a standard and he holds them to that standard, which we didn't see under Westside Jr. Westside Jr., nothing against him. I want to kick a man while he's down, doing well as assistant coach of Chicago. But we all kind of know that, with his name being synonymous with his dad, who is probably one of the most famous Wizards of Bullets in the organization, because he won the only MVP, was part of the only championship team. So maybe a lot of that had to do with him being selected as head coach. But, Brian Keefe, he's shown in a short amount of time that he's definitely the man for the job.
Well, we will see what the Wizards look like this week as the NBA season gets rolling on. If you want to learn more about Washington before their matchup with the Cavaliers on Saturday, make sure you check out the Locked On Wizards podcast with Brandon. Does a great job over there. Brandon, thanks so much for taking the time to do this, man.
Appreciate you, man.
Want to say thank you again to you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen today and every day. Like I said, you can find the show anywhere you get your podcast. Apple, Spotify, anywhere else. Leave us a 5-star rating. Leave a nice review as well. Help me grow the show. I think this is some pretty good Cavs content you're getting. I would love for your friends and family to get the same Cavs content. Be a friend. Tell a friend about the Locked On Cavs podcast. Also, check us out on YouTube. If you're watching this video right now, hit that thumbs up button, click subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest Locked On Cavs content. I will be back tomorrow with another edition of Locked On Cavs. We've got a Cavs practice to talk about, and we are one day closer to the season beginning, so keep it locked right here.